All right, so welcome everyone to today's interview, where I'm very pleased to welcome Professor Cristina Bicchieri. She is the S.J.P. Harvie Professor of Social Thought and Comparative Ethics in the Philosophy and Psychology departments at the University of Pennsylvania. She's also a Professor of Legal Studies in the Wharton School, and she's Director of the Master in Behavioral Decision Sciences program and the Philosophy, Politics, and Economics program. Her work focuses on social norms, game theory, behavioral ethics, and more. Her books include Rationality and Coordination, and then here's two books that were edited with Brian Scrims and Richard Jeffrey, which were The Dynamics of Norms and Logic of Strategy. Also, she wrote The Grammar of Society, The Nature and Dynamics of Social Norms, Norms in the Wild, How to Diagnose, Measure, and Change Social Norms, and a couple others. But yeah, she also has a wide variety of published articles on these and related topics, but feel free to add anything. But with that, welcome and thanks so much for being here, Professor Bicchieri.
Okay, thank you for having me. And I know you have some general question and then more specific question. And I know the general question is, oh my God, what are social norms? Everybody's talking about social norms. And there are many different definitions. Okay. Typically for psychologists, the social norm is what we commonly do. Okay. Which is not very useful because it can be a habit, it can be, some personal norm, or it can be a convention, or it can be a social norm. Okay. So by social norm, the social is important. So by social norm, I mean rules of behavior that are shared, okay, practiced within a group or an entire society. Okay, they can be very local, a particular group has them and that's it, or they can be, widely shared. Now, that's fine. Now, what are the elements that are crucial in the definition of social norms? And to me, I use a sort of, if you will, individualistic conception and constructivist conception. That is, social norms are bundles of expectations. Okay? Sometimes people think of social norms as, a stone put the table. But a social norm is something that is well and alive in our minds. Okay? So is a product of our collective minds in some sense, okay, and is based, its very existence is predicated upon people having certain expectations about other people's behavior, and in the case of a social norm, as opposed, for example, to convention, they also have what I call normative expectations. So they also believe that other people, believe that one should behave in that particular way, that it is appropriate, that is right to behave in that particular way. So when you have these two expectations, this is a precondition to have a social norm. Of course, from our experience, we can say, well, you can tell me, I have all sorts of expectations, but I do not act on them, And so it's very important to be able to decide whether we have preference for action, for behavior that are conditional on this expectation. So having this expectation has, in a sense, a causal influence on behavior. And this may or may not happen, but in a social norm, the conditionality of preference-based condition on the expectation is crucial. Okay? So this is basically, in a nutshell, my definition of social norm. That, of course, is important because it's measurable. We can measure these things. I can measure expectation. I can measure conditionality. And I can always be able to tell you, yes, there is a norm. No, there isn't a norm. And this is very important. Okay? Measurability is very, very important. And measurability is also linked to predictability, etc., etc. So it's a more scientific way of looking at social norms.
Yeah, that's good. That's good that there's a kind of way to measure it and to make it more empirical. You can really clearly test, right, whether there's a social norm. I mean, maybe there can be some unclear cases, but at least you have something to go on that make it a bit more scientific then. Yeah, so I was wondering, so I was thinking like of just kind of stating and then going through the kind of more formal definition you give in one of your books, the Grammar of Society that I mentioned. And yeah, we can sort of, it's a bit more technical, but maybe we can just sort of break it down and explore that. And I had some questions and issues to raise about that. So, okay. So first, a social norm is some sort of behavioral rule for situations of some type S, right? For some population, which is going to be relative to some population, where further conditions are met. And so the important thing is on those further conditions. One is that, so for a sufficiently large subset of that population, each member of that population, each member I, of that subset, knows that rule exists and applies to situations of type S, right?
Yes.
So to kind of be aware of it. And second, and this is important as well, is that members of that subset prefer to conform to that rule in situations of type S on the condition that they believe that a sufficiently large subset of the population conforms to R in that situation, and either believes that a sufficiently large subset of P expects I to conform to R in situations of type S, or has that belief and has certain expectations regarding, well, normativity and potential like reactive attitudes like praise and blame and so on. Yeah, okay, so that's a rough description there. It's definitely a bit of a mouthful. I wanted to sort of break it down and take it step by step. First, I mean, you just talked about social norms being a sort of behavioral rule. How do you want to approach the behavioral rules generally? What is it? And how is it supposed to be different from a social norm? Because I could imagine people thinking of those as like sort of the same thing.
Well, there can be lots of behavioral rules that are private, okay, that are not socially shared. I may have, let's say I am an obsessive compulsive person, so I can have plenty of very specific behavioral rules. Now, if I am at the desk, I put my papers in this order, etc., etc. Or, when I go out of the door in a certain way, etc. People can have a lot of different behavioral rules of behavior, how to behave in this or that situation. This doesn't mean that this is a social rule. It can be a purely personal rule, okay? And so, rule of behavior, yes, there are many. The problem is, is it a social norm? First of all, is it socially shared? This is a crucial question. And second, if it is socially shared, are we cognizant of that? Do we know that? Because for a norm to basically exist, people have to realize there is such a rule, okay, and that is shared. And second, of course, the question of expectation. Do we have expectation about other people, about the prevalence of the behavior, about the acceptability of the behavior, etc.? So these are basically the crucial element. I know that you were sort of worried about my saying a sufficiently large number of people. You asked me, why in your definition, why do you say sufficiently large number of people? And this is very interesting. First of all, you have to think of sufficiently large within a particular reference network. Okay, so for example, a norm may be a norm within a gang. Okay, they have norms. Okay, what does it mean sufficiently large? Let's say a gang is made by 30 people, and each of us must believe that I would say a large majority does it. Okay, not just 10 people, 1/3. That may not be enough. Okay? But the interesting thing is that when we think of this definition, this idea in a sense more specifically, we see that for different people have different thresholds. Okay? And certainly we may think that for some people it is enough to believe that a majority of people, and a majority may be 52%, okay, follow a particular rule, so they have a very low threshold. Some people may have a very high threshold, and, they have to believe that is a very, very large majority. And what I'm saying is very interesting because experimentally, when we, give people some information about some behavior, okay, we have to pay attention to the language we use. Because, for example, if I say many people perform a certain behavior, well, what does many mean? So you have to be non-ambiguous generally in the language we use, especially experimental. Because when I say many people, you may think, okay, maybe 10 people do it, okay, especially if you are against doing that. So you exploit the ambiguity of language. When we say most, it's much clearer. When we use number, it's much clearer. But for example, if I tell you a majority, as the example I was telling you before, you may say, okay, maybe 52%. That's too low for me. Okay? I don't think it's not my threshold. I'm not going to do that. Instead, if I really care about that behavior, I may say a majority must be like more than 80%. And therefore, I will follow it. So it's very, very important, especially for applied work, to be aware that people have different thresholds. Okay? So if we are very clear and if we tell the truth, there is a majority of 70, 80, 90%, that may be enough for most people. But when we are vague in our description, there is a majority, many people do that, etc., we risk a lot because we risk that people who really don't like that behavior, exploit the ambiguity to their advantage.
Yeah, good. I mean, I guess I would think also that not only that it would vary by individual, but like maybe it would vary by like context or like what sort of norm it is. Maybe some norms we require like a higher threshold for what is sufficient. I mean, does that seem right? I mean, is that sort of borne out in the curves?
Yes, this is a very important consideration because we have social norms essentially because there is a tension between our personal desires, our personal welfare, if you will, and collective welfare. We wouldn't have social norm if we didn't have this tension, and we want, in some sense, to solve the tension. And social norms are a social solution to that. Now, the interesting thing is, typically, unless you have internalized the norm, it has become sort of a moral commandment for you, but usually this is not the case. What happens is that there is this tension, and you may not want to follow the norm if you can. Well, one thing that we observe, for example, is that the less observability of behavior there is, the more, good behavior declines. Not always, obviously, but, there is typically a significant decline. So it's very important, to realize that not just observability, but in some sense, the fact that, we can, in some sense, be sure. We want to be sure. We want to have the right expectation. We want to know that most people do that. And most people expect us to do that and prefer us to do that, etc., in order to do that. Some authors, especially sociologists, claim that norms always need sanctions, always survive because of punishment. I don't think so. I don't think so. Very often, we happen to obey norms, even in situations where we could default because we're not observed, etc. Not always, but often we do. And why so? I don't believe some authors say, we have moralized certain things. In certain cases, it must be true. But very often, I think social norms, especially the very common ones, are like default rules. We follow them because we're accustomed to follow them. I recognize a typical situation where I do X, Y, Z. Well, in that situation, I do X, Y, Z without thinking, which is very important and very healthy, if you will, because if I have to stop and think, oh my God, what shall I do, etc., I waste a lot of time. So in some sense, norm coordinate our activities and allow us to do other things while we behave in an appropriate way in the appropriate situation. So there is also this element which is important.
Yeah, that got me thinking because, oftentimes it seems like, your account of a social norm requires that people have a variety of certain beliefs and expectations regarding the population,
yes,
and then the norm and so on. But maybe, is that too strong? Because it seems like a lot of people can engage in social norm practices without much thought or explicit belief about it at all. Maybe. Do you see what I'm getting at? Maybe we don't even need to require that they have those sorts of beliefs if they have the.
I understand this objection. The fact that I follow automatically certain rules, they are very common. The situation where I engage with these rules are common situations that I often encounter, etc., etc. So I don't think much. So does this mean that this belief preference model is too extreme? No, because were something to change, okay? So suppose I am accustomed, to shake hands with people, when I meet them, hello, I shake hands. This is a very common behavior. And in effect, I would say it's a social norm, because if I don't do that, it will be badly interpreted, and people may, if not ostracize, they certainly dislike me, criticize me. I don't want that. Now, however, suppose I come to a very different place and I do it automatically, but I come to a different place and typically I look around and I see how people behave. And tipping is another typical thing. You go to Italy, you don't tip. You are in America, my God, you tip anything. Now we tip everywhere, all the time. And basically, you sort of look around and their belief and expectation play a role. Okay? When something new happens, when your attention is piqued, your observation make you realize that I am in a different situation, and there, of course, beliefs and expectation do matter a lot. So if you put me in a new situation, in a different situation, then you realize, oh my God, I had certain beliefs. Maybe I should have different beliefs now, etc. So it's more the surprise and the difference that make us realize that, we basically behave on the basis of some beliefs that are not just present to our mind every time, but they are there.
Yeah, so maybe it's right to say that we kind of are subconsciously committed to them. They're sort of maybe. Yeah.
When something is like a default rule, you don't think very much, but because this situation is often repeated, is well known. So of course, you follow through.
Yeah, this could easily get into more deep questions about, well, what are our beliefs? What conditions do we have them? But I don't necessarily want to bring that up now. Yeah. Yeah, I was wondering because, as I mentioned, you've done a fair amount of work on like behavioral, experimental, like behavior and
Yeah.
stuff like that. And I wonder, to what extent do you think this is important in your, well, maybe development of your approach to social norms, but also just for the field generally? Like, how important is empirical research to? Yeah.
Very important, very important. The first experiment I did, very first, was an experiment on fairness. Okay. And what I wanted to see is whether the same people put in different situations will still make a fair choice or instead cheat and make an unfair choice. Okay. And this experiment, is the first I did, the first I published, is interesting because it shows that for the large majority of people, and it was an experiment with very many people, fairness is not, I would say, a stable preference. I don't prefer to be fair in every possible circumstance, but that people will behave very fairly in a situation when it is beneficial for them to be fair, and may easily choose fairness when they can do it without penalty. So it was a very important experiment for me because I wanted to show that, fairness, which many economists, especially Ernst Fair, wrote a very important paper about preference for fairness. And the preference for fairness, in his view, is something that you have or don't have, is stable. And what I show with this experiment is that preference is conditional. And therefore, you may not prefer to be fair if you are in a very favorable situation in which people may still believe you are fair, but you're not. Okay, that was the first experiment, and I think it was important, basically to show how people skirt, basically, try to go around social norms. Then I did a lot of experiments, I still do them, basically measuring conditionality, because measuring expectation is relatively easy. Okay, you can do surveys. I can ask you, what do you believe most people in your reference group? This is a parenthesis I want to open. When we think of social norm and we ask questions to people, we always have to be very clear about the reference group. Who are the people you're looking at when you think of certain rules of behavior? It may be a small group, it may be a large population. We have to know that. Okay? So we have to define the reference group. Then I may ask people, what do you expect, the majority of people or most people in this group to do in a particular situation? I want to evaluate, calculate empirical expectation. Then I ask normative expectation. What do you think most people in this reference group approve of? I don't ask you what you approve of. I ask because what you approve may be very different from what you think other people approve. Okay, so I ask you, what do you think most people in this reference group approve? So I have a survey of expectations. Then what I do, I use vignettes. And this is a very important methodology. What is a vignette? I don't ask you what you personally would do in a particular situation, because there is a risk of what we call the experimental effect, that you know what is good, you know what I want, and then you respond as I want. So I have a vignette, 2x2 vignette, in which I ask you about the likelihood of somebody, in some sense very similar to you, as a male of a certain age, a similar profession, in a similar situation, that may be exposed to 4 different situations. In one situation, he knows that the majority of people in this environment do X and the majority approve of X. And then I tell you, what's the likelihood that, let's call him John, would do X? Okay. Then I can ask, in this a completely different cell, in this cell, I ask, most people don't do X and most people don't approve of X. What do you think John will do? Tell me what John will do. And then there are the off-diagonal situation. Most people do X, but most people don't approve of X. Or most people approve, but most people don't do. Okay? And why do I ask? Of course, I don't ask the same person all 4. I ask 1 different people, and I have a large number of people, and then I calculate. Now, the important thing is I want to know if the likelihood that John, your expressed likelihood that John will or will not do something depends on the expectation that John has. So I want to know if you are implicitly assuming that John's preference for behavior depends on his expectations. Okay? That's very important. And with this kind of vignette, I learned that. I also learned something different. I learned when I give people the off-diagonal, most people do, but most people don't approve. Most people approve, but most people don't do. So there is a conflict between empirical and normative expectation. I want to know for specific behavior if this conflict basically end up in favor of descriptive, empirical expectation, or if instead normative expectation may win the day. And this is another famous experiment I did. I show that empirical expectation win the day. That if there is a conflict, people will look at what people do, not what people say, not what people think is appropriate. Most people do that. That's it. That's what I follow.
So on the sort of off-diagonal cases where there's the expectations conflict with how people generally behave, people predict that people will behave in the way people generally behave or something like that, not in the way that...
Yes, people usually predict that, okay, what will John do? Most people do X, but most people don't approve of X. What do you think John will do? John will do X, usually. Okay? Especially, again, social norms, the behavior, may be costly. So if the people do X, this is not a good thing. Oh, they do X. Okay. And they don't approve, but they do. I will do it too. Okay. So again, there is conditionality. Okay. Which is very important. And expectation play an important role.
Right. Doesn't that sort of fall out of the hypothetical though? Because if we're supposing that most people do X and we're asking whether, say, John will do X, I mean, you expect him to do X if most people do X in that situation. Regardless whether people approve or disapprove of X, we're given that most people do X.
Yes, it's very interesting. Actually, another thing that I'm doing now, I'm finishing a paper and I did experiment on inferences that people make. Okay. Now, in that vignette, in the typical vignette that I do, you don't have to make any inference. I tell you the normative, the empirical expectation, they are in line with each other, they oppose each other, and then I see what people, the likelihood they calculate. But what I am very interested in, and I tell you in parentheses why I'm interested in, because there is a lot of work in what is now called norm nudging. So what is norm nudging? Norm nudging is this practice or in public policy of, say, economic incentives may not work, they are expensive, the legal system, the legal rules may not work, because people go around them, but maybe social influence may work. Okay, and what I mean social influence may work is if I believe social influence may work, I will give you information about the prevalence of a certain behavior, okay, or how many people approve of this behavior, etc. And this is used in so-called norm nudging. And it's very interesting because norm nudging is a black box. Sometimes it's successful, sometimes it's not. We don't know why. We don't know. It's completely mysterious. Why? Because there is no analysis of the cognitive underpinning of norm nudging. So what I did a study of the social inference that people make when they are given social information. So, for example, if I tell you most people do X, what do you infer about their approval of X? Typically, if X is a good thing, typically people will infer, oh yes, most people approve of X. They do it, they approve of it. Okay. However, positive behavior, if I tell you, most people approve of X, you will not infer that most people do X. There is an asymmetry between the empirical message and the inference, the normative inference versus a normative message and the empirical inference. The big asymmetry for positive behavior. For negative behavior, there is an asymmetry, but it's the opposite. Okay? If I tell you most people approve of bribing public officer, people will think, no, probably most people do that. But if I tell you most people do bribe public officer, people don't immediately infer that most people approve of that. It's very interesting. So it's something like that. So I'm very interested in basically studying the cognitive process that goes behind getting information about what most people do, what most people approve or disapprove of, etc. We get this information. What do we and why do we infer one way or another? And I have big study about that.
Yeah, very interesting. And stuff of this stuff of norm nudging seems like it's sort of ripe for further empirical research as well.
Yes.
Yeah, I did want to ask about a couple other things at least. So one is, and I know we've written about this a bit. What do you think about the sort of historical development of social norms? Do you think it's a relatively recent thing in kind of human history, or do you think it's something that's sort of developed a lot longer?
The existence of social norms? Yeah. Well, some people say they exist in animals. If you look, for example, at chimps that are closer to us, different groups seem to have different rules of interaction. So, it's very hard because we cannot talk to them. So, do they have... certainly they have expectations. Certainly they seem to have expectation, empirical expectation at least. They expect certain behavior, and if they don't observe this behavior, they are surprised, they show surprise, etc. Do they have normative expectation, thinking that behavior is right? They may think is right in a very minimal sense, certainly not in a moral sense or anything like that. But, again, we know so little. But there are studies about, the existence of norms. Again, very basic in animals, especially in chimps. And for humans, I think if you look at ancient civilizations, certainly they have very, very clear norms in almost every area of life. Very, very clear and very strict sometimes. So I think it coordinates, the function is to coordinate behavior. In a sense, you can predict behavior. I know what to expect from you and you know what to expect from me in a variety of situations. And so this is very important for the functioning of society, for social order. Would be difficult to think of social order if you cannot predict, etc. It would be a very costly life. To think every time, oh my God, what shall I do? what's the appropriate thing to do? How will people respond to this and that? No. I think social norms are a crucial staple of any society.
Yeah, I would almost think that as soon as you get populations with sort of requisite cognitive capacities and the sort of social features, then you're probably going to get something like social norms developing just because, well, people have their own aims and then they end up working together and then these sort of rules develop and so on.
Absolutely. Once you live together and we work together, we act together as, hunters and gatherers. Look at hunters and gatherers. They certainly have norms. Clearly, it's been studied, etc. So I think that whenever you have a group, a stable group of human beings, you have social norms. Also because it is, in some sense, in your interest for your survival, to live with a group and to support a group, even if there may be conflict with what you want and what the group needs. And that's how social norms emerge.
Yeah. I was also wondering, you've work on like game theory and rationality and stuff. And I wonder, like, some of the stuff we've talked about here, it seems like you could give maybe a game theory type account of, well, how these social norms play out and develop and so on. I mean, what do you think about the connection between social norms and like game theory as a account?
Well, a game theoretic definition, which is what I gave, is interesting because, again, when I say social norms are a coordinating device, the example I gave in my first book on norms, The Grammar of Society, is we have a typical non-cooperative game, mixed motive game, like a prisoner dilemma, let's say. And the very existence of a social norm transformed this game into a coordination game. And instead of one equilibrium, now we have two equilibria. And it is as if people always play a Bayesian game in which, of course, you have a certain probability of meeting a non-follower and also a probability of meeting who's not. And depending on your experience, the probability will vary with that. You will behave in the appropriate way. And certainly because it's a coordination game, you will do much better if you cooperate than if you don't cooperate. Okay? But the norm has transformed the game. The norm is never born within a coordination game. As I told you, because there is always this tension, okay? The norm is there to solve the tension. Solving the tension means that it creates a new game. Now, the interesting thing is what I'm saying. It looks as if, there are two equilibria, either you follow or don't follow the norm. Very often, a norm is not just one behavior. For example, think of trust games. Okay, in a trust game, there is somebody who has a certain amount of money. Let's say I have $4, and I decide, I can give 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 to you if I play with you, and it's anonymous. And suppose I decide to invest all my $4, and then the experimenter multiplied by 3, so you receive $12. Okay? And if I give you so much, everything, obviously I expect you to reciprocate. I want to induce you, I signal, you reciprocate. Now the question is, what is a norm of reciprocity? What does it mean to reciprocate? And reciprocity is not just one number. Reciprocity may mean that you give me back my $4, you make me whole, you give me 5, you give me 6 out of what you receive, or you give me maybe a little more than 6. Okay? So reciprocity is the norm of reciprocity has many instantiations, includes a set of values. So there are multiple possible equilibria. Now, in different cultures, some equilibria are more salient than others. Okay? Let's say in our culture, we may say, 6-6 is what most people would do. And we can, in fact, do some experiment and incentivize our subject and asking them, okay, giving back for, what do you think most people, think is appropriate? Giving back 4, how many people will say is appropriate? Giving back 5, how many people, etc., etc. And you can see the distribution, if you will, of approval, and maybe there is a central tendency toward 6-6, but there may not be. But the important thing is that very often a norm has several instantiations, especially in game theory. Okay? And therefore, there are several equilibria. And again, there are various components that may make one equilibrium more salient than others. This doesn't mean that the norm is weak. It can be a very strong norm. Reciprocity may be very strong. We expect reciprocity, but what sort of reciprocity may vary?
Right. You might expect some reciprocity, but what exactly might be a bit more fluid than that.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah, I was wondering also, what do you think are some of the connections that we might be able to draw between facts about social norms and normative expectations and stuff, and just general questions of normativity and morality and meta ethics and stuff like that? I mean, do you think there's a lot of connections to be drawn? I mean, it's a very difficult question, maybe, but I mean,
yeah, there are lots of connections. I mean, I make a big distinction, a very basic distinction between moral and social norms, where by moral norm, I think that you have an unconditional preference to follow a certain behavior, a certain rule or whatever. So the moral is in some sense unconditional. I don't care what most people do or what people approve. To me, the moral thing is say, do no harm. Okay? I may find myself in a situation where people, perform very harmful acts. A moral rule would mean I don't. Okay, I resist, etc. Now, do we have many moral rules? I don't think so. I think most of our rules, like fairness, reciprocity, are social, not moral. And you see that when I do the vignette experiment, preference for fairness behavior, reciprocity, conditional on expectation. While a moral norm, I think, is unconditional. So that's why I say there are very few.
That's interesting. I sort of would expect that most people would think sort of the reverse, that most of these things are moral norms rather than, and then social norms are sort of the less common thing. But yeah, you're saying it's probably more a social phenomenon than the moral norms.
Well, again, if there is conditionality, if expectation of what other people do, what other people think is appropriate or not, matters so much, can we still talk of a moral norm?
It's less clear. I mean, yeah.
Exactly. I think I am discussing this now with psychologists, for example. We want to write something about moral norms, etc. Because again, psychologists tend to think globally of norm of fairness as moral norms. But again, if they are so conditional, in my view, can we still call them moral? Or is just, they think of a moral domain, a moral ontology, independently of conditionality, non-conditionality, etc. But I think this is a mistake. Okay, to me, conditionality or lack of conditionality is a really, really important dividing line. And that's why I say there are very few moral norms. More and more. Okay.
Fair enough, yeah.
Which doesn't mean that we, behave horribly. Not at all. We have lots of very good social norms that we follow. And, they are like defaults, thanks God, in society, etc. But it's very interesting. I think, for example, to harm or not to harm is more moral than social.
I was wondering, one thing you've written on to some extent is about changing social norms. And I was wondering, how do you think social norms change maybe more organically, and then how do you think they change as a matter of, well, individual or small group action, or like how do we go about changing our social norms?
Okay. There are two questions here. One is a question about intervention. How can we intervene to change certain social norm or to implement new norms, etc. This is a very important question that a lot of NGOs, a lot of humanitarian organizations ask. They have asked that for female genital cutting, child marriage, lot of what we consider harmful practices, etc. And typically, as I say in my second book on norm in the wild, if you see that over and over again, there are usually trendsetters that start the change. So there are people who really dislike the norm, who really think differently, and they have certain characteristics. And I won't list them here, you find them in my chapter on trendsetter in Norms in the Wild. But the interesting thing is a trendsetter may not be successful at all. They will try to change behavior. It may be the case that they find followers. It may be the case that they don't find followers. So it's always a relatively risky activity. And we cannot predict who and how many will follow because it's a matter of threshold. And predicting people threshold, knowing people threshold, is very hard. We don't know. There is a typical work on technological change. And the work on technological change shows an S-shaped curve where you have a few trendsetters that say, start using the telephone, the new telephone, And then the hypothesis is that thresholds are continuous. So one person change, and then there is another person that only need one person to do something to change themselves. And then there is a third person that only needs two, etc. And so there is a continuous smooth curve. With social norm, we don't have that. With social norm, we may have a threshold, let's say a very common threshold, maybe 30% or 40%, and maybe very hard to reach that threshold. And then you have a tipping point, okay? But you cannot predict tipping point because we don't know thresholds. So change occurs. Predicting that it will occur is very hard. One other thing that we can do, and again, I do that in experiments with artificial agents. So what we model is, let's say we have a very nice, closed society in which everybody follows a particular norm. But then the society is invaded, okay, by a few people who do something very different. And then, depending on the model you have, if people are Bayesian or not Bayesian, then Bayesian or something else, then I can predict, I can tell you what will happen in that society. If the norm will decline, how fast it will decline, if it will stay stable or not, etc. This is an issue we study stability of norms. Again, I can do a model of that. Can I predict? I can explain with this model how certain debacle of social norm occurred. Can I predict that? Very hard. I can explain, I can't predict.
Good. Yeah, that actually it reminds me a lot of last year I talked with this philosopher, Herman Capella, and we talked about conceptual engineering and like concept change. And this is sort of reminiscent of this. And it's like sometimes it's kind of hard to maybe predict or even control how our sort of concepts and term use and so on will change or evolve. But
I completely agree. And evolutionary models are very good at explaining, but very bad at predicting. Because it's very hard, It's very hard to predict when a stable system will become unstable. Very hard.
Okay, I did want to cover a couple other maybe potential worries for the approach. One is I was wondering, is this potentially going to be too broad? Because I don't want to count just like every sort of convention or expected behavior or anything like that. I don't want to count everything as a social norm. Like maybe, like, I don't know. I had this example of people sort of expect people to, when they make cereal, to add the cereal first to the bowl and then the milk after. It's like, well, I don't want to say this. Is there like a social norm there as a result? It seems like not the right sort of thing that would count as a social norm. You see what I'm getting at? I don't about how we might be worried that they count as too broad about what counts as a social norm.
But no, okay. If you look at psychology, it's very broad because psychologists would always say it's common behavior. Okay, there is many types of behavior. Some are based on certain type of expectation. Some are not. A customary behavior. We do it as a custom. It's a collective habit. Is it based on any expectation? No. It fulfill, is a means to fulfill certain ends. Is maybe the only means we know. When I did for the Gates Foundation a study on open defecation in India, a common idea is, well, maybe open defecation is a norm. No, I discovered it's not a norm at all. It's a custom. Everybody does it. It's very convenient. Why not? And the question is, well, how to eliminate it and create a norm of toilet usage? That was the interesting thing. So we have to be very, very careful when we have a common behavior. Okay, when we see a very, a behavior that is very, very, very practiced by very many people. Okay, to say, oh, it's a norm, because saying it's a norm means nothing. Okay, if I say it's a social norm, it means there is a conditional preference for following it, and it's based on empirical and normative expectation. End of story. Okay, and I can measure that. So sometimes we may think something is a social norm. It is not, but we have to experiment on that. We have to prove that. And my theory basically gives you the tools to do that. Okay, that's my answer to the generic, norming question.
Yeah, no, that's great. I mean, I guess we've already this sort of gets at what I was gonna ask next. And you sort of talked about some related things, but like, I mean, what do you think are some of the like upshots of thinking about norms in this way? Apart from, as you said, like it gives us, we're able to predict and sort of quantify where there are social norms and so on. Maybe, I don't know, how might this help with things like public policy and, trying to influence change in society and so on? Do you think this approach to norms can be useful there?
That's $1 million question. Because norm nudging, which is used quite widely. I give you an example so you understand what I mean. In England, Michael Holsworth, who was the one or among the people who created the UK government nudging unit, okay, there was a problem that in London, certain doctors overprescribe antibiotics. Okay, so the question is, how do we curb this? Okay, and the intelligent idea was, okay, well, doctors, the hypothesis, let's say, are sensitive to what other doctors do. Okay, so let's do a survey and let's look at how many doctors actually in the London area prescribe antibiotics. The result was encouraging because the majority did not overprescribe antibiotics. So what they did, they sent around information about, what the majority of doctors in London do with antibiotics. And those overprescribers suddenly saw that they were doing something really opposite what the majority did, and it was useful. They lower, okay? But look what they did, which is interesting. They didn't say the majority of MDs, of practitioners in England prescribe few antibiotics. Why? I am a doctor in London. I overprescribe, but I think, well, England, there is a lot of countryside. There are a lot of places where people will not need antibiotics. Okay? In Scotland, do they need all these antibiotics? They have pure air. London, is very congested. There is very bad air to breathe, etc. So I'm right to prescribe all these antibiotics. So it's what I told you at the beginning, the reference network is important. And so what Michael did was write reference network, doctors in London, so you don't have an excuse. And he gave the right number, which was a good number. They lower antibiotic prescription. They were successful. Okay. However, the important thing is in many cases, they have not been successful. And the question is, they don't really know why. That's why I'm doing all this work on the cognitive underpinning of getting information about other people's belief and behavior. That's why it is important. I think it will help public policy to think more clearly about, well, what do we have to do to send an appropriate message in this circumstance? But in principle, I think it's a very good technique.
Good. Yeah. I was sort of wondering, sort of related there. What do you? I mean, this is an example, but what do you think are some of the kind of major sort of open questions, unsolved problems in this area that maybe you or other people working on these things might look into?
Well, I think they have to be very, very careful in looking, and that's a work I'm doing, to the cognitive underpinning, because, for example, we want people to vaccinate more. There is a huge anti-vax movement. We want people, to behave in a way which is better for the environment, etc. So there are lots of things that we hope people will engage in. And of course, you can, put incentive in place, a fine or prices to do certain things, but you cannot do it forever. And you're not changing people's mind. So the question is, do you believe social influence will work? I think it does. The question is how, knowing how. And all the work I'm doing now is to understand how, to produce good, effective social influence. So I give you another example. If I tell you, most people recycle, and you look around you and you see that there is little recycling. Okay? So there is an incongruence between the message and your environment, the observation. What happens when there is an incongruence? Well, you tend to discount the message, okay? To think, where are these many people? Well, certainly not here, okay? So you will give what we call a pragmatic interpretation of the message. Versus if there is no incongruence, you give a semantic interpretation. Okay, right. Most people recycle, maybe I should do it too. While when you give a pragmatic interpretation, you start thinking, why are you telling me this if I live in a place where I don't recycle? Is this message credible? If it's not credible, I do something else, etc., etc. So it's very interesting also looking at the difference between semantic and pragmatic interpretation of messages. which is something that happens very often.
Yeah, good. It's kind of very complicated, and then
it is. But I think experiments help us to tease apart these different influences, etc. I think this is very important. Okay, I hope my work is important in this respect for future norm nudging, basically.
Yeah, fair enough. It's funny because I normally like to end with a kind of meta philosophical question about like the value of philosophy and maybe more specifically the value of the philosophy that you work on. But here it's you sort of already answered that effectively in this sort of stuff you talked about.
Philosophy. This is I want to conclude with this thought about philosophy. Philosophy gives you an analytical frame of mind, which is crucial in many areas of thought. And I think philosophers can do very well if they apply their thinking, to maybe more realistic situation, to real life problems, etc. Exactly because we bring a very peculiar frame of mind, if you want, very analytical, and I think we can help a lot. So I think philosophy and philosophy in particular should think more about, how can we respond to certain big general scientific problems. Very often I am a philosopher of science by training, and of course we study science and write about that. But even, a philosopher who's not an epistemologist or a person who does moral philosophy, I think we have a very analytical frame of mind that we should put to good use. I may conclude with that.
Yeah, that's a good spot as any to conclude. Yeah, no, that's really great. So yeah, we'll finish there. The questions and everything up. So thanks so much for coming on, Professor Bicchieri, and it's been really great having you and getting to hear your thoughts on these issues. It's been great.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure for me. Goodbye.